Thank you so much for joining us for this at-home study of Paul's letter to Philemon. I hope that you've got some friends and family close by that you can share this time of study with. I hope that you have a Bible nearby or a smartphone or something you can use to look up some scriptures in just a few minutes. Christianity is easy on paper. I mean, everybody says, I like the idea of loving my neighbor and forgiving people. The problem is, it gets kind of difficult when you actually have someone in your life that needs forgiveness. Forgiveness is fun until you actually have to do it. When we study the book of Philemon, we're going to run into one of those places where Christianity becomes practical very quickly. It's not theoretical. It's not something that's just left in the realm of things that apply to church. It's where the rubber meets the road. And I'm hoping that we can treat the book of Philemon as kind of a case study for us to think a little bit more about practical Christianity, how Christianity is lived. So I want to start with a pretty simple exercise. I want you to do two things, and I think you can do this. First, I want you to read the entire letter from Paul to Philemon. Now again, I hope that doesn't freak you out too much because it is less than one piece of paper if you print it in 11-point font. It is 355 words. It takes the average English reader 3.5 minutes to read it out loud. So you can do this. So if you've got some people at home with you, I'd like you to read the book of Philemon out loud so that you can hear the book in the same way that Philemon would have heard the book. And I want you to hear the whole thing all at once so that you can get an idea of what the letter's like. If I sent you a letter in the mail, that's what you'd do. You'd open it and you'd read it from beginning to end. So that's what you're going to do with the book of Philemon. The second thing I want you to do while you're reading, I want you to try to put yourself in Philemon's shoes. I'll have a few questions that I want you to answer as a group. What would it have been like to be Philemon? What would it be like to have a slave run away? How would you feel? How would that affect your life? How would you want to respond to it? What kind of person was Philemon? What would it be like to hear that the guy who ran away from you and betrayed you was converted and now was coming back? What sort of mixture of emotions might you have? What's your first reaction? What are the competing feelings you have? And what would it be like to get a letter from the Apostle Paul about a personal situation in your life? What would your response be to that? Now, I know what you're thinking. I've already forgotten all those questions. That's all right. I'm going to put them on the screen for you. Thing one, I want you to read Philemon. Thing two, I want you to talk about those questions and just dig in as much as you can to the person Philemon in this story. He's the slave owner who has a slave run away. When you get done with that, come right back, just pause the video and I'll still be here. When you're done, resume the video and we'll continue our study of Philemon. Okay, I hope there are a few things that you noticed about Philemon the guy. Philemon, by nature of being a slave owner, was at the very least upper middle class. He might not have been full-on Belle Meade, but he had some money. We assume that the Aphia mentioned in verse 2 is his wife. The church is meeting in his home, so that's another clue that he's probably a guy who's got some dough. Did you catch the relationship that Paul had with Philemon? In verse 4, Paul says that he is always thankful every time he thinks about Philemon. I have some people in my life that as soon as I think of them, I'm sparked with gratitude and joy. And I have some other people in my life who, when they walk out of the room, I'm sparked with gratitude and joy. That tells you a little bit something about what Philemon must have been like. In verse 6, he refers to the sharing of the faith. That's the same word, koinonia, which is translated fellowship or partnership. So Paul views Philemon as a gospel partner, as a co-worker. Verse 7, Paul says that Philemon is a good guy. He derives much joy and comfort from his love. Philemon has refreshed the other saints. One more little detail stood out to me in verse 19. It says, to say nothing of your owing me even your own self. Most of the commentators take this line to mean that Paul was the one who converted Philemon, so Philemon really owed Paul something. Now, if it weren't for Paul, Philemon wouldn't have been who he was. When you and I hear the word slave owner, I don't know what comes into your mind, but I kind of picture a guy in 1861 standing on the front porch of a plantation in a big white suit. And when he is not busy taking a draw from his cigar, I imagine him beating his slaves for fun. He is kind of the villain. He is the bad guy. So I need you to put that image out of your mind when you read Philemon, because that's not the sort of guy that Philemon was. He was a nice guy. He was a patron of the church. He was an encourager. He was a friend of Paul, and the sort of guy that made Paul thankful for him to be around. Philemon wasn't perfect, but Philemon was a guy who'd be a member in good standing of almost any church, as best that I can tell. Now again, I know this is hard for us because we're not used to thinking about slavery in any other terms than the terrible, terrible things that have happened to slaves. But don't let that bad part overshadow the rest of who Philemon really was. Yes, he's wealthy. Yes, he's a slave owner, but he is a friend. He's a gospel partner. He encourages the saints. He's opened his home to the church as well. So this is a dilemma. Already we face a dilemma. What do you do when a guy who's really good is doing things that you and I find morally reprehensible? That's the first collision we run into right off the bat in Philemon. This is where the rubber meets the road. How is a Christian supposed to respond to a runaway slave who becomes a Christian and is starting to come back? If you were in Philemon's shoes, how would you feel? I know that's hard to imagine. I thought about this. I thought, what would you feel? And I tell you, my immediate reaction is to try to baptize my response. I kind of want to give you a good church answer and say, I'm glad that he has come home. That's really nice. But I can all but guarantee you that is not Philemon's immediate response. How do I know that? Well, because every time in every place that I look at history and a slave owner finds out that his slave has run away, he is furious. He is beyond mad. Economically, losing a slave is a big loss. It's a betrayal if this is somebody that you trusted to work in your home. Philemon is going to be hot about this. There are a couple of gems from history that help us here. Pliny the Younger, maybe you've heard about him as a historian. He wrote a letter to an aristocrat named Sabinius. And I'll include a link to that letter somewhere in the comments if you'd like to read it. But Sabinius had a slave who ran away, a lot like Philemon. Pliny wrote advice to him, and he wrote of just how angry he must be and how justified he was to be angry. Now, I know it's hard for us to relate to this culture. It seems so different. But I want to make sure that you know what the culture was like during this time. History again tells us that slaves were not considered to be persons in Roman society. Legally, they didn't have ancestors. They could have children, but the children weren't their children. They wouldn't inherit anything. Their children were their master's property. They had no right to own property. Their testimony was barred from the courtroom, that is, unless they were tortured, because it was believed that the slave would always do whatever his master asked of him. So if you tortured the slave, then he would probably tell the truth. Again, I know this is foreign to us. This is not the world that we live in. It's not the world we want to live in. But this is the world that Philemon did live in. By the way, it was also illegal to harbor or aid a runaway slave. That puts Paul in a unique position when Onesimus is spending time with him. Runaway slaves could be punished by being whipped, being burned with hot irons, even by being executed. History tells us that some slaves were branded with the letters F-U-G on their forehead, short for fugitive in Latin, a mark they would have to carry for the rest of their lives. In fact, archaeologists have discovered metal collars that would sometimes be welded or forged in place around a slave's neck. One found in Rome says, "I have run away. Catch me if you can. If you take me back to my master Zoninus, you will be rewarded." That's the world that Onesimus lived in. So think about Philemon again. Philemon is in an interesting position. He's living in a culture that thinks this way about slaves. That's what he grew up believing. That's what the police department believes. That's what the courts believe. That's what the guy across the street believes. That's what everybody in his union believes. That's what everyone thinks about slaves. They aren't people. They don't have souls. But Philemon is a Christ follower. And Philemon might not have connected all of the dots about what being a Christ follower means. And he might not understand everything about what it means to treat another person as if they are bearers of the image of God. But he knows this much. He knows that Jesus was the sort of Lord who said the first and greatest commandment is love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, strength, and mind. And the second, which is like it, is this: love your neighbor as yourself. Do you see the conflict? Do you see the conundrum he's facing? Philemon has to decide what to do. Onesimus is a new Christian. How does that complicate things? You know, it's easy for Philemon when Onesimus was just a slave, just property. But now Onesimus is his brother in Christ. So what do you do with this? How do you deal with this? The worldviews collide. The Roman way of looking at people and the Jesus way of looking at people. Which will win? What choice will Philemon make? By the way, as if this conflict weren't already difficult enough, you might have noticed that there is some evidence that Onesimus might have stolen from Philemon on his way out. In verse 18, Paul says, if he has wronged you at all or owes you anything, charge that to my account. Why would Paul say that unless he had some cause to believe that Onesimus had taken something from Philemon? So how would you feel if you were Philemon? I can tell you the answer. You'd be angry because you've been betrayed. You've lost money, you've lost opportunity, but now you have some choices to make. How do we solve this problem? How do we reconcile this issue? I want to pause again and give you just a minute to think and to share. What options do you think Philemon had? What could he have done when he gets a letter saying, your slave is here, I can send him back to you if you'd like? What are the things that Philemon could have done? I'll share my list with you when we come back, but I want you and your group to list as many options as you can possibly think of, and I want you to think of some pros and cons of each option. Why would that be a good idea? Why would it be a bad idea? Why would it be a biblical idea? Why would it not be a biblical idea? What choices or consequences or expenses would come from making that choice? I want you to think as much as you can about what Philemon would do. Pause the video, and when you get your list finished, resume, and we'll look at our lists together. Okay, here is my list of what I came up with of Philemon's options. I basically came up with three major options. Number one is the most likely. Option one, Philemon could have stewed in his anger and had Onesimus punished as the law allowed. He could have even had him executed. He would have been well within his legal rights. Philemon's friends and neighbors would have congratulated him for taking a hard line. After all, if Philemon doesn't do this, they might be concerned that their slaves would get uppity and run off and cause them the same sort of pain and suffering. He could have even had a claim against Paul for aiding and harboring this fugitive and not immediately returning. He could have lashed out at Paul. But now that Onesimus has become a Christian, and now that Onesimus is Philemon's brother, and now that he is expressing what seems to be genuine repentance, is that really how you want to treat your brother? What about what Jesus said about forgiveness and turn the other cheek and let the one without sin cast the first stone? How does that play into this equation? Did you notice, by the way, how this story reads so much like the prodigal son story? Onesimus ran away from his master's household. He goes off to a foreign land, and presumably at some point he has an awakening when he meets Paul. He returns to his senses and he's seeking an opportunity to go back to his master's house. So it begs the question, what role in this story will Philemon take? Will he act like the merciful father? Or will he act like the cranky older brother? Philemon's got a choice that he has to make. So punishing or killing Onesimus is, in the Roman view, just and acceptable, maybe even praiseworthy. It's fair. But that's the Roman world. And the Roman world is supposed to be different than the Christian world. So that brings us to option two. Option two is that Philemon could have just let Onesimus stay with Paul. After all, in verse 13, Paul said, I'd be glad for him to stay with me. I could use his help. It would be a nice compromise. Philemon gets to just go away. Philemon gets to have Onesimus just go away. He doesn't have to punish him, so he sort of feels like, I've done a nice thing. I've turned the other cheek. I've forgiven. And at the same time, that gives Philemon an out so he doesn't have to face his neighbors and explain why he didn't punish him. It lets everybody save face. It's a compromise solution. And it's a really attractive solution. But what's missing? Well, if Onesimus is his brother now, and Onesimus has done him wrong and is seeking an opportunity to make it right, doesn't Philemon have the responsibility to give Onesimus that chance? And by this point, it's not even just an Onesimus-Philemon thing. Remember, there's a church that meets in Philemon's house that has no doubt heard this story already. This option, as easy as it is, might just be too easy. It's sticking our heads in the sand and wishing the problem would go away, which is why it's the option that most Christian people would tend to take, I believe. We can't stomach the first option. That seems too harsh, but anything else sounds too scary or too risky or too vulnerable, so we just ignore the problem and we hope that it goes away. We ignore bad behavior and we hope that nobody ever talks about it again. I may be speculating too much, but has it occurred to you that there might be a reason that Onesimus ran away? Has it occurred to you that there might be a reason in Philemon's behavior that Onesimus would want to run away? And is it possible that Onesimus is not the only one who owes someone an apology in this story? Is it possible that Philemon needs to make some things right? Maybe so. Option 3. Philemon and Onesimus could do the hard, dirty work of reconciliation. What exactly does this mean? I'm not entirely sure what this would have looked like. But if Onesimus comes back and Philemon puts his hand around him and says, "Welcome home, brother," everyone in the neighborhood is going to talk. They're going to have some questions. Some people are going to say, "Philemon, you have gotten soft in your old age. You have ruined things for the neighborhood." Some people are going to look at Onesimus and say, "Man, tell me how to get away with that." But some other people are going to look at the story and say, "Something strange is happening here. I want to know what's going on." Paul encourages Philemon to see Onesimus in an entirely new light, not just as property, and not just as an annoyance or a nuisance or a problem to be solved. In verse 10, Paul refers to Onesimus as my child whom I fathered in the faith. Verse 11, Paul calls out the irony of his name. Onesimus means useful, and in verse 11, when he was a runaway, he was useless. But because of the change Jesus has brought in his life, the useless one has become useful again. Paul is helping Philemon see the good that Jesus brought in Onesimus' life. In verse 12, Paul describes just how much he loves Onesimus. Sending him is like sending part of his own heart. And in verse 13, he encourages him to see Onesimus as a servant of the gospel. Paul is helping Philemon see Onesimus as a Jesus follower, as a person. He even pushes this line a little bit further in verses 15 and 16. He says, "Perhaps this is why he was parted from you for a while, that you might have him back forever, no longer as a bondservant, but more than a bondservant, as a beloved brother, especially to me, but how much more to you, both in the flesh and the Lord." Do you like what Paul's doing? He is helping Philemon see Onesimus, not through the lens of slavery or financial opportunity gained or lost, but through Christianity. He's helping Philemon look at the world not through the Roman worldview, but through the Jesus worldview. He's asking him to remember that he's part of the Jesus story, not some other story. Was this going to be difficult? Yeah. Were there going to be hurt feelings that had to be talked through? Yeah. Was it going to take some time for Philemon to trust Onesimus again? Probably so. Did Onesimus have some grudges that he might need to get out? Were there some other slaves who were going to be really confused by this? Yes, yes, and yes. And by the way, I think in the seeds of this story are eventually the things that will cause Christians to recognize the evil of slavery. This story, while it doesn't bring the immediate abolition, is one of the stories that leads to the ultimate abolition of slavery, I think. The path of reconciliation takes work. It causes everyone to do some soul searching and ask some hard questions and evaluate, is the way we're doing life the right way to do life? But it's powerful and it works. It's so simple and it's so beautiful. And all you have to do is look at things through the lens of the Jesus story, not the America story, or the Republican story, or the Democrat story, or the rich person story, the poor person story, or the white person story, or the black person story, or the nerd story, or the jock story, or the emo story, through the Jesus story. If we can learn this skill, to look at life through this lens, have this mind among yourselves, which is yours in Christ Jesus, who did not consider equality with God a thing to be grasped, but he made himself nothing. That's what we're called to do, to follow in his steps. I would be lying to you if I told you that this comes easily to us. We are used to looking through the lenses of our upbringing and our culture. We are really quick to say, this is fair or this is just. These are my rights. How many times have you heard somebody in the last few weeks say, these are my rights? This is what I deserve. But remember this, the gospel story is a story about the fact that someone suffered something that wasn't fair, that wasn't right, so that he could bless some people who didn't deserve it. That's the story you and I inhabit. And that's the story that Paul is helping Philemon remember, so that Philemon will remember what Jesus did for him so that he can do it for Onesimus. He is calling for Philemon to fully locate himself in the story of Jesus. And that's my challenge to you in this study today. I get it. An eye for an eye is really attractive and it feels really good. Somebody's got to pay. I really want the guy who does me wrong to get it, even if that wrong is just cutting me off in traffic. But somebody said that eye for eye, tooth for tooth is a just, satisfying, and rapid way to a sightless, toothless world. That's what's going to happen. As soon as I hold that standard to someone else, it's going to come right back to me. The Jesus way doesn't pretend that bad things didn't happen. It doesn't stick its head in the sand, and it doesn't ignore the opportunity for mercy. It does the hard work of reconciliation and love, and it gets better results. All Paul asked of Philemon was to act like Christianity actually had something to say about the way he conducted his business. He's asking Paul is asking Philemon to act like Christianity speaks to how you treat people in your normal life. It's where the rubber meets the road. As we close our time together in this study, I'd like you to do 3 more things with me. First, would you share with the people around you a group or a time or a place or a story when someone you know or you yourself had to make the choice that Philemon made, when it would be easy for you to treat somebody according to the story you grew up in, but something changed and you treated them according to the Jesus story? I know this is a really hard question, but I want you to think about a time that you saw this happen. You saw someone use the Jesus story instead of the eye for an eye story or instead of the problem story. What caused it to happen? How did it work out? Why did you make that choice? Share a story about a time that you really engaged the Jesus story. Number 2, before you close, I'd really like your group to get together and pray for eyes to see opportunities to see the Jesus story in moments like these. It would have been really easy for this story to have had a bunch of different endings. For Onesimus never to come back, for Philemon to have him executed without a trial. But the Jesus story changed the story. How many opportunities have we missed to do kingdom good because we didn't stop to look through the Jesus lens? Pray for an opportunity to see the world that way. Pray what Jesus told you to pray for your enemies and those who persecute you. Thing 3, when you finish those 2 things, those 2 are the most important, I'd really like to hear from you. If you've watched this video online, I'd love for you to leave a comment and just say, hey, I was here. And I'm asking that for a silly reason. I just want to know that this is worth your time to do. A lot of people help us put these videos together, and if nobody's using them, I can think of something better to do with our afternoons. So if you don't mind, just leave a note in the comments, say I was here, and just share this with somebody to see if it's helpful to them. Okay, here's the plan. Next week, we're going to get back together. I'll share another video with you, and this time, instead of looking at it through Philemon's eyes, I want us to put ourselves in Onesimus' shoes and think how he experienced this story of grace. Thanks so much for joining us today. Good luck as you continue your study.